Virtual reality was seen as the future of video games. For a long time they tried to market it to people, but by the looks of it, it seems that VR never got the mass appeal that they had hoped for. Being loved by many, but not bought by many, I wanted to detail what happened to VR. From its overpriced nature to its impractical requirements, this is the lost potential of VR. The beginning. In order to start this video, I'll need to start from the beginning of how virtual reality started. It started with a concept called virtual, a concept that was started back in the 14th to 1500s, which is a word that basically means something that exists but can't really be touched. And this word has a lot to do with the technological advances we have today, being a term that has been used in software since 1959, and the earliest use of the term virtual reality can be traced down to a French avant-garde by an artist called Antoine Artaud back in 1938. I need to add that Antoine Artaud was French, so a lot of his work was probably made in French, but an English version of his book was made in 1958, and the original name translated to virtual reality, but the English version was called The Theatre and Its Double. This is the earliest known use of the term virtual reality, and there are two different types of realities. There is augmented reality and virtual reality. The term augmented reality has been around since the 1970s, just under a different name. It was called artificial reality. Artificial reality is a concept that was started by Myron Krieger, who is a computer artist that has a PhD in computer science. He created a book series called Artificial Reality, a book series that consists of 2 books. And basically what artificial reality means is displaying digital objects in the real world and making them look like they exist in real life. And he later on went to have a huge hand in the virtual reality and meta industry, working on many projects related to that subject. One of the first people to make a book referencing virtual reality was Damien Broderick, who was a science fiction writer and editor who has worked on a lot of science fiction related projects and is credited to be one of the first people to use the term virtual reality in a science fiction book. In a book he made called Judas Mandela back in 1982, the term virtual reality would make its way around more, with many more people taking an interest in it. And a person who has really helped it grow into its own industry was a man called Jaron Lanier, who shaped the virtual reality that we have today with his team at VPL Research. That was a company that was dedicated to developing virtual reality products. Then you also get a movie called Lawnmower Man, which is a movie about virtual reality that was back in 1992 and how the whole concept would work back then. Augmented reality was a concept that was basically updated by 2 men called David Mizzle and Thomas Cordell, who worked for the company Boeing to develop augmented reality for the company. They helped develop an industrial augmented reality and made it all happen with a head-mounted display, and they later on created the term augmented reality. The origins of virtual and augmented reality is interesting because for a long time they had nothing to do with video games. These were tools to help people in real life scenarios, and starting out, it spent most of its time in the conceptual phase. It was only until people would start to invest real money that we would see more VR and AR related things. It would only be until the 1970s to the 1990s that technology would be advanced enough and that there were enough people doing research that we would see more of an appeal towards VR and AR. The earliest uses were more for medical uses, flight sims, and it would also be used for military training. A man called David M., who is a computer artist, developed virtual worlds for NASA from 1977 to 1984, and during that time period in 1978, a team at MIT would develop the Aspen movie map, which was a virtual tour of Aspen, and the virtual tour had 3 different modes. The modes were summer, winter, and polygons. Then in 1979, a man called Eric Howlett would develop the Large Expansive Extra Perspective, or LEAP for short. This was basically a tool that would trick the eyes into giving them a field of view that would feel realistic. Then in 1985, LEAP would be redesigned for the NASA Ames Research Center, and this would be the first virtual reality installation. Then a man called Scott Fisher would develop something called the View, which stands for Virtual Interactive Environment Workstation, and Leap would be what most VR headsets are still based off of today. In the 80s is when a more gaming oriented focus would be given to VR. The man responsible is Jaron Liner, the same guy I mentioned before. He started VPL Research, and VPL Research that would make many VR related products. With them trying to make VR more of a household name, they would create such products as the Data Glove and the Power Glove. Then VPL Research even created the Data Suit, which is something that still feels like science fiction today, but of course it's just real. Then in 1990 they filed for bankruptcy, then 8 years later they sold all their assets. Atari would try their hand at VR back in 1982, but it wouldn't go well for them because of the video game crash a year later in 1983. But some of the employees still kept their own research about VR. In 1988 something called Cyberspace Project was started. It was something that would allow VR on the standard home computers. The person in charge, called Eric Goshen, left in 1990 to start a company called Sense8, a company that would develop the World Toolkit Virtual Reality SDK, which was somewhat of a breakthrough because it was the first real-time graphics with texture mapping on a PC. Just to summarize a little bit, from the 90s to the 2000s, VR never really changed that much over the years. VR has always stayed the same. People took it in different directions, especially with people trying to create virtual worlds, because in 1991, Sega would announce the Sega VR for Mega Drive. It would have LCD screens and a visor and stereo headphones, and it had inertial sensors that allowed the system to track and react to the movements of the user's head. And ironically, in that same year, a company called Virtuality would launch the first mass-produced, networked multiplayer VR entertainment system that would be released in many countries. The whole VR setup in question would cost up to $73,000 per multi-pod Virtuality system. The setup featured a headset and exoskeleton gloves, and this would be one of the first immersive VR experiences. And ironically, a group from the Electric Visualization Laboratory created the first cubic immersive room. It was called the Cave Automatic Virtual Environment, or just CAVE for short, which allowed people to see through their own eyes instead of using a headset. Then in 1995, Nintendo made their own VR called Virtual Boy, and throughout the years, many people would create similar concepts that would function more or less the same, but would vastly improve the quality, and the hardware would get more powerful, but it would also become more expensive. Now let's get to more modern things about VR. In 2010 is when the first prototype of the Oculus Rift would be invented. It was created by a man called Palmer Luckey. It was built on the shell of another VR headset, and it only had rotational tracking, but it had 90-degree field of vision that had never really been done at the time. Then in 2012, the Rift had been shown at E3 by John Carmack. Then in 2014, Facebook bought Oculus VR for an estimated $2 billion, but it was later revealed that it was $3 billion. But then later, Facebook and Oculus would be sued by ZeniMax for company secrets being taken to a different company. John Carmack used to work for ZeniMax, but everything was settled out of court. The whole craze around VR would get a lot of people interested. Seeing VR as a new opportunity, things would spawn many different VR headsets and VR related things. For example, in that same year, Facebook bought Oculus is when PlayStation would announce their own VR that they were working on for the PS4. Then in late 2014, there was a Chinese VR called Ant VR. Then in 2015, Google started Cardboard that uses a box that has lenses with an app that gives a small VR experience from your smartphone. Then also in the same year 2015, HTC and Valve announced their VR headset called HTC Vive, and Razer unveiled its open source project called OS VR. By 2016, there were at least 230 companies developing VR related products. 2016 really was an eventful year for virtual reality, because in 2016 again is when the first units of the HTC Vive Stream VR headset would be shipped. This would be the first commercial release of sensor-based tracking that would allow for free movement in a specific space. Then in 2017, Sony would file a patent for their VR that was similar to the HTC Vive. The only difference was Sony would be developing a wireless VR headset. Things would be pretty good for VR for the next few years to come, with there being many new versions of VR headsets and them getting more and more advanced. In 2019, Oculus released the Oculus Rift S and the Oculus Quest. These headsets used an inside-out tracking system instead of using an outside-in tracking system like most other VR headsets. Then in 2019 again, Valve would release the Valve Index, which is a headset that had 130-degree field of view, and it also had off-ear headphones and open-handed controllers that would allow for individual finger tracking and a front expansion slot. Then in 2020, the Oculus Quest 2 would be released, and its name would be changed to the Meta Quest 2. The Meta Quest 2 would feature a sharper screen, cheaper price, and better performance. Since the headset was owned by Facebook, it would need a Facebook account, but they later changed that to where you don't need one. And an interesting fact is that in 2021, the Oculus Quest 2 accounted for 80% of all VR headsets sold, and in 2021 again, the EASA approved the first VR-based flight simulation training device that was made by Loft Dynamics, and EASA stands for European Union Aviation Safety Agency, and this would be one of the more serious uses for VR to help pilots better and more safely learn how to fly. Then in 2022, the Meta Quest Pro would be released. It would have a new design and many new upgrades. It had high-resolution color video pass-through. It also had integrated face and eye tracking with pancake lenses, with an updated Touch Pro controllers and onboard motion tracking.
In 2023, Sony released the PSVR 2, which was an upgrade from the PS4 VR that is for the PS5. It would have more or less the same upgrades as the Meta Quest Pro, but it would have foveated rendering and a higher resolution OLED display. It had controllers with adaptive triggers with haptic feedback. It also had 3D audio with a wider FOV. It started out as a PS5 exclusive, but they later on made it compatible for PC through a PC adapter. Then in 2023 again, the Meta Quest 3 was made, and it had more or less the same upgrades as the PSVR 2. Then in 2024, Meta released a budget version of the Meta Quest 3. It was called the Meta Quest 3S, which was basically more like an updated version of the Quest 2. Then in 2024 again, Apple released the Apple Vision Pro, which on a personal note is the biggest waste of money I have ever seen. For reference, this thing costs almost $4,000, and just to let you guys know, $4,000 in South African rands is 72,387 rand and 60 cents, which is more expensive than the most expensive iPhone you can get. And to save you the time of explaining what it is, you're essentially paying $4,000 for an iPhone overlay over your eyes. And again, in 2024, there was another VR flight simulation training device that was FAA approved, and it was made by Loft Dynamics again, the same people who made the same thing in 2021. Of course, it is an upgrade of its previous version in 2021, but this time it was EASA and FAA approved, and to this day, it is the only VR FSTD that is EASA and FAA approved. And by the way, FSTD stands for Flight Simulation Training Device.
If you have made it to this point in the video, I am very thankful. This is one of my first times making a video this long, and I know there are areas I can improve on. Please feel free to comment on my attempt at this new style. This video is a lot of work. But getting back to the video, the problem with VR is that it has never been cheap. It has never been cheap to make or to buy. If you make it too cheap, then people complain it's too cheap. If you make it too expensive, then people complain it's too expensive. It is an amazing concept, and the fact that we have gotten this far is great. But unfortunately, it's just not practical. You need to have a good amount of money to buy one. Then you need a good amount of space to use it. And then you're probably going to be playing alone most of the time, because even though a lot of people have it, I bet that there is nobody else near you in your friend group that also has one. And yes, I know that there are probably groups of people out there who all have their own VR headsets, but that is rare. From my personal experience, I have a racing wheel, and don't get me wrong, it is really fun to play, but I am the only one out of my whole friend group that has a racing wheel. So I really have no friends to play with on my wheel, and it's not like racing wheels are cheap either, so I just consider it something that only I can enjoy. VR is nice, but we can't forget a lot of the health issues it has, because with VR, not everyone can actually use it. There are a lot of safety and health measures that need to be taken before someone can use a VR headset.
It is not exactly plug and play. For example, a number of unwanted symptoms have been caused by prolonged use of virtual reality. Most virtual reality systems come with consumer warnings, including seizures, developmental issues in children, trip and fall and collision warnings, discomfort, repetitive stress injury, and interference with medical devices. Some users may experience twitches, seizures, or blackouts while using VR headsets. Even if you don't have a history of epilepsy and have never had blackouts or seizures before, 1 in 4,000 people, or 0.025%, may experience these symptoms. Motion sickness, eye strain, headaches, and discomfort are the most prevalent short-term adverse effects. VR headsets may regularly cause eye fatigue because people tend to blink less when watching screens, causing their eyes to become more dried out. Virtual reality sickness, also known as cyber sickness, occurs when exposure to virtual environments causes symptoms that are similar to motion sickness. Women are significantly more affected than men at rates of around 77% and 33% respectively. The most common symptoms are general discomfort, headache, stomach awareness, nausea, vomiting, pallor, sweating, fatigue, drowsiness, and distortion and apathy. For the record, I am not a medical professional and nor have I ever worked in the medical field, so all of this is copied. The other thing is, VR isn't really built for kids. Kids are sensitive because their bodies haven't developed yet, so there are very strict age restrictions on VR headsets. And even with kids, I would say that kids should be supervised by an adult when using a VR headset. But of course, depends on how old the child is, because a study showed that 26% of US teens own a VR device and only 5% of them use it daily, while 48% of teen headset owners only seldom use it. And I'm not surprised by those statistics. VR is cool and fun, but the novelty wears off really fast, and as we know, kids these days are always hopping onto the newest trend, and even now, VR is not in as much of the general interest as it used to be. I would also say that there isn't that much innovation when it comes to VR. At this point, it seems like there isn't that much to do on VR. If you have a PC, you have a lot of games to play, but I haven't heard too much about VR on PlayStation. For the most part, VR has been successful for a good amount of time, but the lack of being a household name is what left the industry stagnant, because even with AR and VR, they are not as versatile as their creators would have wanted. The designs are very expensive, uncomfortable, and clunky. People had hoped that by now we would have reached Ready Player One level of AR and VR, but clearly the practical side of it doesn't exist, because have you seen how much the stuff to have that Ready Player One level costs? And the truth is, we have had those things since the late 90s and early 2000s, but there just never was a way to make it practical enough to sell to people. I would also say that the lack of console support has hurt the market, because for a long time, Xbox has been excluded from VR, and it's either you need to have a PlayStation or a PC to enjoy VR. And yes, I know, they are standalone VRs, but they serve no purpose outside of a console, because even with the health risks, almost nobody will be on it daily, and it's better if it's linked to a console, because then it makes more sense to have one. Think of it this way, think of the arcade. It's a place you like to go, there's lots of games and fun to be had, but you wouldn't want to take the whole thing home with you. It would be really expensive and unsustainable. Imagine the price of the electric bill, and it's the same case with VR. There is only a certain amount of VR that you can take home with you. For a long time, VR has been expensive, and the perfect VR setup would be insanely expensive. Factoring in the time to build it, the VR hardware and the rig you would need would be a lot of effort for something that hasn't truly been perfected yet. It seems like VR still hasn't really left the conceptual phase. A lot of it is still trying to be improved, but it seems like more of the hardware than the video games. It seems that VR hasn't caught up yet to the point of where it can compete with consoles, and to be honest, I don't think gamers ever want VR to replace or compete with consoles. I would say that enjoying some of your favorite games through VR would be awesome, but the experience of playing games in VR hasn't caught up to consoles. From my personal experience, VR and simulation are the same, and from what I have learned as using your body as the controller is, really becomes a chore. The amount of fatigue you feel after long periods of time. For example, play Gran Turismo 5 or 7 on controller and you'll see how easy it is to do 10 laps, but then go on PC and play a Assetto course on a racing wheel and you'll feel tired after just 3 laps. I personally play Assetto Corsa on PC, and since I am playing on a wheel, I am in charge of shifting gears, managing the throttle, steering the car, and checking my rear view mirrors. It's a lot of work. It's a good experience, but it does get tiresome, and I can imagine that a lot of people who bought racing sims and VR headsets feel more or less the same way I do. We are very far away from the point of where we are even close to Ready Player One, especially getting to the point of where all that is decently priced. Even though Oculus tried to make it as cheap as possible, I kind of feel that they were the only ones really trying, because they have been the most prominent company that has been leading VR and trying to make it possible to be a household name. They managed to get in a good amount of homes, but I also feel that the greed of Facebook got in the way of their true potential. And with that, this is the Chilly Man signing off. I thank everyone for watching. Peace out.